Here are some of the craziest cults from every time period in history. The Thuggee. Back when most of humanity was still figuring out basic agriculture, one group in India had already perfected something far more sinister. For thousands of years, a secret society operated across the Indian subcontinent with one singular purpose: ritual murder in the name of the goddess Kali. They were called the Thuggee, and they are the most successful serial killers in human history. The Thuggee weren't your typical cult. They didn't live in compounds or wear matching robes. They were normal members of society, farmers, merchants, family men who would leave home for months at a time on what they called their business trips. And in a way, it was business. They would join traveling groups on the roads of India, gain their trust over days or even weeks, and then, when the moment was right, they'd strike. Their weapon of choice? A yellow silk scarf called a rumal. One quick twist around the neck, and it was over. The Thuggee believed that every person they strangled was a sacrifice to Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction and time. And Kali apparently had quite the appetite. Here's what makes the Thuggee absolutely insane. They weren't some cult that lasted a few years or even a few decades. Historical records suggest they operated from as early as 1300 BC, all the way until the British Empire stamped them out in the 1800s. That's thousands of years of cult murder. The British East India Company estimated that the Thuggee killed approximately 1 million people, but some historians put that number closer to 2 million. The Thuggee had their own language, their own signs, and even an entire system of operation. They would scout travelers, identify wealthy targets, and plan their attacks with military precision. After the strangulation, they'd rob the bodies and bury them in carefully prepared graves, often using a special pickaxe that was itself considered sacred. Nothing was left to chance. They even had a retirement system. Once you'd strangled enough people, you could train the next generation. It was literally a multi-generational cult of murder. The British Army finally brought them down in the 1830s, capturing and executing thousands of Thuggee members. But even then, the cult's influence was so widespread that it took decades to fully eliminate. The word thug that we use today? Yeah, that comes directly from these guys. They were so notorious that their name became synonymous with violent criminals everywhere. Not exactly the legacy most cults are going for, but hey, they definitely made an impact. The Nizari Ismailis. While Europe was busy with crusades and feudalism in the 11th century, a different kind of religious movement was emerging in the mountains of Persia. These weren't your typical religious zealots. They were highly trained killers who operated from impenetrable mountain fortresses and pioneered the art of political assassination. They were so effective and so terrifying that their name became synonymous with murder itself. Meet the Nizari Ismailis, better known as the Assassins, the cult that literally created the word we still use today. The Assassins were founded in 1090 by Hassan is-Sabah, a charismatic leader who had broken away from mainstream Islam. Hassan seized control of a fortress in the mountains of northern Iran and declared it to be the headquarters of his new order. From this impregnable mountain stronghold, Hassan would launch a campaign of targeted killings that would terrorize the Middle East for nearly 2 centuries. The Assassins weren't mindless killers. They were surgical, precise, and terrifyingly patient. They would spend years infiltrating courts, gaining trust, becoming advisors or servants to their targets, and then strike when the moment was perfect. The Assassins killed crusader leaders, caliphs, and basically anyone else who threatened their interests. They built a network of fortresses across Persia and Syria, creating what was essentially a state within a state. At their peak, they held dozens of fortified positions and commanded the loyalty of thousands of followers. They didn't conquer territory with armies. Instead, they shaped politics through fear and targeted violence. Kings and generals preferred changing their laws rather than risk an assassin's blade. They finally met their match in the form of the Mongols. In 1256, the Mongol general Hulagu Khan decided he had had enough of this mountain cult and their political murders. The Mongols besieged the assassin fortresses, and unlike previous armies, they didn't leave until every single assassin was killed. The Anabaptists. If you thought religious extremism was a modern problem, let me tell you about the time an entire German city went absolutely insane for Jesus. The year is 1534, and the city of Munster has just been taken over by a group of radical Anabaptists who believe the apocalypse is coming any day now. And when I say taken over, I don't mean they won an election. I mean, they literally seized control of the city, expelled everyone who disagreed with them, and declared the city New Jerusalem. Things were about to get pretty crazy. These cultists believed that the end times were upon us, and that Munster was the only place on Earth that would be spared from God's wrath. Their leader, a guy named Jan Mattis, proclaimed himself a prophet and declared some pretty wild new rules. All property was to be shared communally, all books except the Bible needed to be burned, and money was to be abolished. And if you weren't cool with any of this, you were kicked out of the city in the middle of winter with nothing but the clothes on your back. But don't worry, it gets worse. After Mattis got himself killed in an ambush, a new leader emerged, Jan van Leyden, a charismatic lunatic who decided that God had told him some pretty specific things. First, that polygamy was not only allowed, but mandatory. Second, that he, Jan van Leyden, was actually the king of New Jerusalem and the entire world. And last but not least, anyone who disagreed with him should be executed immediately. Over the course of about a year, Jan married 16 women, including the widow of the previous prophet, and forced other men in the city to do the same. Women who refused to marry were ruthlessly executed. One of Jan's own wives criticized him, so he beheaded her himself in the public square, and then made his other wives dance around her corpse. Yeah, totally normal behavior. Meanwhile, the city was under siege by a combined Catholic and Protestant army, who were understandably concerned about the Anabaptist revolution spreading. The siege lasted over a year, and during that time, things inside Munster deteriorated rapidly. Food ran out, people started starving, and there are documented accounts of cannibalism occurring within the city walls. The city had become a living nightmare, but Jan van Leyden kept insisting that God would deliver them salvation any day now. Spoiler alert, God did not save them. In June 1535, the city finally fell when 2 Anabaptist guards betrayed the cult and opened the gates. The revenge was brutal. The surviving Anabaptist leaders, including Jan van Leyden, were captured, tortured extensively, and then executed. Their bodies were placed in iron cages and hung from the church tower as a warning to anyone who might get similar ideas. Those cages are still hanging there today, over 450 years later. The Heavenly Kingdom. Imagine you're living in China in the year 1850. Your country has been humiliated by Western powers in the Opium Wars, the government is corrupt, and suddenly, a guy shows up claiming to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ. Not a metaphorical brother, nor a spiritual brother, but literally Jesus' actual younger brother. The craziest part is that somehow, this claim is convincing enough that within a few years, he's leading a rebellion that will kill more people than World War I. Meet Hong Xiuquan and the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the deadliest cult in human history. Hong Xiuquan was a failed civic servant who had a mental breakdown after failing the imperial examinations for the 4th time. During his breakdown, he had visions of an old man and a middle-aged man who told him that he was their younger son and brother, sent to rid the world of demons. After reading some Christian missionary pamphlets, Hong decided that the old man was God. The middle-aged man was Jesus Christ, and therefore he, Hong Xiuquan, was the actual younger brother of Jesus. Hong began preaching his divine mission to establish the heavenly kingdom on earth by destroying the Qing dynasty, which he claimed was ruled by demons. His message resonated with millions of impoverished Chinese peasants who were desperate for change. By 1851, Hong had assembled an army of followers and declared the establishment of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, with himself as the Heavenly King. The Taiping Rebellion had begun, and it would rage for 14 years, consuming southern China in an apocalyptic conflict that still stands as one of the bloodiest wars in human history. The Taiping ideology was a bizarre mix of Christianity and Chinese tradition, along with Hong's personal delusions. Hong claimed to receive regular visits from God and Jesus in his dreams, where they would give him specific instructions for running his kingdom. At its peak, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled territory inhabited by roughly 30 million people. Hong established a capital in Nanjing, where he lived in a massive palace with dozens of concubines, despite preaching strict sexual morality for everyone else. A classic cult leader move. You remember Jan van Leyden, right? The war against the Qing Empire and later against European-backed forces was absolutely brutal. Entire cities were massacred. Millions died in combat, with tens of millions more dying from disease and starvation. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 20 million people, but some historians argue it was closer to 30 million or even higher. To put it in perspective, the Taiping Rebellion killed more people than World War I, and it happened 70 years earlier with swords and muskets instead of machine guns and artillery. When the rebellion finally ended in 1864 with the fall of Nanjing, Hong Xiuquan was already dead, possibly from suicide or food poisoning. His son, who claimed to be Jesus' nephew, was captured and executed. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom collapsed, but the scars it left on China lasted for generations. The KKK. Not all cults operate in distant lands or ancient times. In the 1920s, if you wanted to watch a nice, horrifying parade with your family, you could head down to Main Street and watch thousands of people in white hoods and robes march by. We're talking about the Ku Klux Klan, America's most dangerous homegrown cult that was started in 1865 and is still active to this day. The first version of the KKK was founded in 1865 by Confederate soldiers who were very upset that the South had lost the Civil War, and that black people were now, legally human beings with rights. They started as a social club, but quickly evolved into a terrorist organization dedicated to maintaining injustice through intimidation, violence, and murder. They dressed in white robes with hoods, partially to hide their identities, and partly because they claimed to be the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. They would ride at night, burning crosses, destroying property, and lynching anyone who opposed them. The first version of this cult was destroyed by the American Army by the 1870s. But what came next was even worse. The second Klan, founded in 1915, was even bigger and somehow more mainstream. At its peak in the 1920s, the KKK had somewhere between 4 and 6 million members. They weren't just in the South anymore either. They had massive influence in Indiana, Oregon, and other northern states. They weren't just targeting dark-skinned people anymore either. They were going against anyone who didn't fit their vision of an ideal America. They influenced elections, controlled politicians, and operated openly with parades down Main Street in full Klan clothing. This cult had elaborate initiation ceremonies involving oaths, crosses, and declarations of loyalty to the Invisible Empire. They had their own vocabulary, with terms like Imperial Wizard that sound like they're from a bad fantasy novel, but were deadly serious. The violence was constant and brutal. Lynchings, bombings, assassinations, all carried out by members who believed they would face no consequences. And often, they didn't. Local law enforcement was frequently infiltrated by Klan members, and even when they weren't, juries refused to convict them for their crimes. Estimates of people killed by the KKK are hard to pin down because many murders were never officially recorded. But historians estimate at least several thousand documented deaths, and likely many more that were never counted. The Klan has fragmented and reformed multiple times since the 1920s, with various Klan groups still existing today. But thankfully, their influence is now mostly historical. The movement of restoration. As we approach the end of the 20th century, you'd think humanity would have learned some lessons about cults and mass death. But somehow, in the year 2000, in Uganda, a cult managed to orchestrate one of the most horrifying mass murders in modern history. The movement of the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God was founded in the late 1980s by a group of former Catholics who believed the world was going to end on December 31st, 1999. Their leaders included a former prostitute named Credonia Merwinde, who claimed to receive visions from the Virgin Mary, and an exiled priest named Joseph Kebwetere. Their ideology was an extreme version of Catholicism, mixed with apocalyptic fever. They preached strict adherence to the Ten Commandments, which conveniently included giving all your money and property to the cult leaders. They enforced long periods of silence, with members only allowed to speak on certain days, and also required members to fast to the point of starvation. It was a recipe for complete psychological control. The cult grew to around 5,000 members at its peak, operating several compounds across Uganda. Members sold their possessions and gave everything to the movement, believing they would ascend to heaven once the apocalypse came. Then, the day of reckoning, December 31st, 1999, finally arrived. As the hours ticked by, midnight came and went, but the world didn't end. Now, normally, when a doomsday prediction fails, one of two things happens. Either the cult leader admits they were wrong and the cult falls apart, or they claim they miscalculated and set a new date. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments went with a horrifying third option. On March 17, 2000, the cult leaders announced a final celebration from their compound in Kanungu. Over 500 members gathered in a small church building for what they thought was a prayer service. The doors and windows had been nailed shut from the outside. The members distributed soda and blessed it, telling members it would help them ascend to heaven. Then, they set the entire building on fire. The church burned with everyone inside. Men, women, and children all burned alive while the doors were nailed shut. The screaming could be heard from miles away. When authorities finally investigated the ashes, they found over 500 bodies burned beyond recognition. But that wasn't the end of it. As police began investigating the cult's other properties, they made a series of increasingly horrific discoveries. At the compound in Kanungu, they found a mass grave with 153 bodies, including dozens of children. At another site, they found 155 bodies buried in a garden, many showing signs of strangulation or poisoning. At yet another compound, 81 more bodies. The discoveries kept coming, and the death toll kept rising. In total, authorities found at least 778 bodies, though some estimates put the real number over 1,000. The most shocking discovery was that these acts weren't mass suicide like they initially appeared. It was mass murder. What makes this even more disturbing is that there were warning signs everywhere. Former members had tried to report the cult to authorities, claiming that children were disappearing and people were being held against their will. But local officials did nothing. The cult leaders, Merowende and Kebwetere, were never found. They're believed to have either died in one of the fires they set or escaped to another country. To this day, nobody knows exactly where they are. The movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God represents everything terrifying about cults in the modern era. This cult existed recently, in the age of the internet and social media. It's a reminder that cult violence isn't some relic of the past. It's still happening, right now, in places where vulnerable people are looking for meaning but end up finding monsters instead. Do you want to see more dark history content like this? Check out the other videos. We've got plenty more where this came from. See you in the next one.